Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sparring Deck series. If you haven't checked out the first video where I go through every single deck in detail, be sure to do so because I assume you've come from there. Now today we'll be looking at a different matchup from last time. We saw Jinteki and Leela battle out. This time it's HB versus Shaper. But first, I want to bring your attention to some changes I made to the HB deck. These changes were made because after some playtesting I realized that the old HB deck did not have enough money, which was pretty ridiculous considering that it basically was stuffed to the brim with campaigns. So I've made some minor adjustments, but fear not, if you've watched the old video, many of the things I mentioned in it still apply. Namely, it's still Architects of Tomorrow, it's still a Glacier deck, we've just put in more money with Breaker Bay Grid and the Root. Because of this, we had to take out the old Hollywood Grid, which used to be a defensive upgrade, meaning this new deck relies more heavily on Ash. Now, before we move on, let me talk about Breaker Bay Grid, because this is easily one of the simplest cards on first glance, yet causes a lot of rules problems for newbies because it works in perhaps an unintuitive way or a confusing way. So let me clear this up if you're new to the game. The long story short is that Breaker Bay Grid reduces the cost of assets and upgrades installed in the same remote server by 5 credits. It does not reduce the cost of ice protecting the same server. This is because ice protecting Breaker Bay Grid are considered to be protecting the server. They are not in the server, which is what Breaker Bay Grid discounts. You also cannot get discounts on upgrades installed in central servers. If your Breaker Bay Grid is installed in central server, for the most part it is useless because it will not make upgrades in central servers cheaper, and you cannot install assets in centrals. So do reserve your Breaker Bay Grids for the remote. Alright, another thing is, remember the last time when we talked about this deck, I mentioned some tricks you could do with Baltic Labor. Well, I've cut the Baltic Labor from this deck as it was pretty expensive, so now you no longer have the option to fast advance 3 advanceable agenda from hand. Fast advance meaning that you can score agenda in the same turn as installing it from hand. Instead, we are going to use another way in which to sneak our 4 advanceable agendas from the table on into your score area, and that is with Jeeves Model Baroids. The main benefit of this asset is that when res, you are able to quadruple advance your agendas, so taking your agendas from 0 advancements to 4 advancements in a single turn, as long as you pre-install your agenda the turn before. Jeeves Model Baroids does so because it gives you an extra click after you advance it 3 times, since advancing the card 3 times in a row constitutes the trigger for Jeeves, and gives you an extra click with which you can advance 1 more time. The other side effect of Jeeves is that it's actually not useless outside of turns where you want to score agendas, because it gives you more clicks and hence more efficiency during your other turns. You can, for example, click for 3 times to gain an extra click with Jeeves, or to install 3 cards. These cards don't even have to be of the same type. You can install 1 ice, 1 upgrade, and 1 asset for your first 3 clicks, and that will also trigger Jeeves, giving you an extra click to do something else. Finally, Jeeves also triggers on Purging Virus counters. Even though it's a single action, it takes up all 3 clicks doing the same thing. Therefore, you will get an extra click after Purging Virus counters if Jeeves is res. This is a very powerful card, and something that the runner probably wants to prioritize trashing as a result. Alright, we'll move on to the matchup specific tips and tricks versus Haley the Shaper. You must note that our opponent will be very good at locking R&D and remote, because as Shapers they have superior R&D pressure and their breakers are pretty efficient, allowing them to run through your remote pretty easily. As such, you need to defend both servers very well, and one way you can defend R&D is by using this Ice Miraju, which looks pretty out of place of this deck at first sight. The main reason to have Miraju in this deck is to defend against indexing. How you use it is you keep it a secret. You leave it unres until your opponent indexes you. When they index you, you still leave it unres. You let them pass through the ice. They will then arrange your deck, usually putting agendas on top so that they can rerun R&D and steal it. When they do so, you res the Miraju and give them a tough choice. If they break the Miraju, they get deflected and have to rerun R&D in order to steal your agendas. If they let Mirajus one-sub-routine fire, well, they're in for a treat. You get to shuffle your R&D, meaning that the agenda they just put on top is no longer there. This is a very good way to defend against indexing, and is why I put this in the deck. As for playing the Haley player, because you're up against a Glacier deck, you have to be worried about their ice, because that's their main weapon. And there's some really nasty ice in the deck, which you should be privy about before embarking on this matchup. The first is Architect. Architect is not the most taxing ice in the world, because once you have Brahmin out that you see on the screen, it is 1 credit to break, very trivial. However, you typically don't have the resources to break it early, because to install Brahmin you need 4 credits, which is pretty expensive. You need 2 memory, and also you need to worry about the downside where you have to add 1 installed program that is not a virus to the top of your stack. Ideally, this should be a cheap program. If you use Brahmin to add itself back onto R&D, onto the stack, you are losing a lot of tempo. So you have to be aware of this early on. So typically you want to be very passive until you have a way to break Architect reliably. You don't want to let Architect fire, because this usually gives a huge momentum swing to the court. It is one of the most powerful ice on the HB side. The other being Fairchild 3. This is another nasty ice that a lot of newer players might run into trouble with. The general rule of thumb is that you need to run early in your turn, first click in fact, in order to use 3 clicks to break all 3 subroutines. Alternatively, if you have a David out, that's fine, because David deals with Fairchild 3 perfectly. It is on the perfect strength at 5 strength, and it has 3 counters, 1 for each subroutine. So these are your answers to the nastiest ice in the HB deck, and let's see whether my opponent, who is Triss, who will be playing the Haley deck, can penetrate through my servers as I seek to build as the Architect of Tomorrow. We kick off this game with an opening hand with 3 agendas. Now if you're playing a fast corp deck, one that tries to score agendas early, you want some agendas in hand, but this is definitely not one of those cases. We are playing a slow Glacier deck. Gotta mulligan this hand. Our new hand is not much better. Even after the opening draw, we only have 1 piece of ice in the Seder Adaptive Barrier. Now, one thing that I want to emphasize on throughout this video is ice placement. This is a very skill testing and key part of playing any corp deck. Where do you place this first piece of ice? Is it on R&D? Is it on HQ? Now, this requires a bit of metagame knowledge. If we are up against Shaper, we know that they typically excel at R&D and remote pressure, so I would not put this ice on HQ, especially given that we are not flooded with agendas. We only have 1 agenda in hand. So did I put my ice on R&D or the remote? The answer is neither. That's right, I held it back because I wanted to adopt a wait and see approach before deciding where the best location is. I knew that Haley doesn't like to play aggressive early, because if she does, she'll be sacrificing tempo that could otherwise be used to set up her board. So I allow her to freely come into any of my servers, even the new remote I install. If they run my new remote, which is an Adonis campaign, they have to choose to either trash it, which will set their early economy back by a lot, or leave it there and allow me to set up that server next turn by protecting it with the ice. So that's the intention. I do not want to commit the ice to the remote just yet. But if my opponent gives me the Adonis campaign, I will most certainly protect it, as you see here. Seder Adaptive Barrier is basically the perfect ice to find in this situation. There are not that many ice in your deck that end the run, and even fewer so those that cannot be clicked through. Seder Adaptive Barrier is basically the only one that fits both of these. As such, it is the perfect fit on the remote. And you definitely want it as the innermost ice. One useful ice placement tip is that typically you want your end the run ice further inside of the server and non-end the run ice further outside the server, because if your opponent gets through your end the run ice early on in the run and are unable to break the later ice, they can still get to the end of your server and perhaps steal whatever agendas are in there. If you do it the other way around, however, if they run out of money before hitting your end the run ice, they cannot continue on with the run, and your agenda or whatever's in the remote will be safe. So this is why Seder Adaptive Barrier is perfect in this position that you see right here. Another important high-level concept with this deck is to manage your economy. Specifically, you want to maximize it. You have a lot of economy cards in your deck. As you can see from my hand right now, I have an Adonis Campaign and the Root, both of which are huge economy cards that can pay out up to 3 credits per turn, combined with the Adonis Campaign that's currently in my remote. That is a lot of cash. However, it's not that easy to get all of it out. If I install any of Adonis Campaign or the Root in a new remote server without protecting it with ice, you bet my opponent will run it and trash it. They have Parisia installed, which reduces the trash costs of assets by 2, making it much more favorable for them to trash my assets. So because of this, I need to be very careful when laying out new remotes, as I'm doing here. At some point, I will definitely consider investing ice into the second remote so as to allow myself to benefit from having 2 campaigns running at the same time. Unfortunately, right now I'm not in a position to do that because I haven't drawn enough ice yet. I've drawn all my money, but very little in the way of ice. And the thing is, if you spread yourself too thin, you run the risk of your opponent being able to get through your main remote server, the very first one I created. So you have to strike a very good balance there. In this scenario, I chose to double ice my first remote first, because I knew that a single Seder Adaptive Barrier was very porous. By placing a second ice there, not only do I threaten another expensive ice, I also increase the taxation power of the first ice, because Seder Adaptive Barrier increases with strength as you add more ice to your server. Therefore, really encouraging you to build that tall, well-defended server that is a pain for your opponent to get through. Another benefit of icing your remote servers very well is that your opponent is very unlikely to check your face down cards if they are defended by ice. You can see here that when my first Adonis Campaign ran out, I sneakily put a Vitruvius in there and my opponent did not notice. As such, I was able to score it, and you notice that I actually managed to get an agenda counter on it. You see the number 1 on the agenda in my score area. This is an agenda counter obtained from quadruple advancing it. And how I got those 4 advancements in a single turn? That's right, it's Jeeves Motorbioids coming into play. My opponent did not check the Jeeves either. As a result, I was able to get this Vitruvius up, which now allows me to, at no cost of clicks whatsoever, send a card from my archives into my HQ. This can be very useful for recurring a key card, and is something worth keeping in mind as we continue on with the game. Now, speaking of the game, my opponent is slowly but surely setting up their breaker suite. They have installed their Brahman, which is their main breaker. It's pretty efficient, despite requiring my opponent to send one of their installed programs back to their stack every time they use it. You must keep in mind that they have some installed programs which are cheap to recur, such as the Parisia that you see on the board. That costs 0 to install. Very trivial for my opponent to send it back to the stack and install it again after drawing. So with that breaker out, my opponent is now able to play more aggressively. They start off with a legwork and sweeps my hand for any agendas, fetching 1 agenda that was sitting there. So HQ pressure is very important. You notice that throughout the entire game, my HQ has been left undefended. My opponent did not punish me for the first agenda which I scored, but now with the second agenda that I drew, they managed to snag it from my hand, equalizing the score at 2 apiece. They also slapped down a Tapworm, an important card that gets them economy. It is fairly important to deny them this economy, especially since it increases with power the richer you get. So here I purge virus counters to trash the Tapworm, denying them the economic opportunity. Because once your opponent gets too rich, you run into the great risk of them being able to run through your R&D, run through your remote, and pay for the Ash trace. Ash is your main defensive upgrade. It is the main way in which you can guarantee your agendas to be scored. If the run is rich, obviously, even Ash is not going to save your bacon. Most crucially, you need to have more credits than the runner in order to guarantee that your agenda stays unstolen. Alright, so as you can see, my opponent has lots of resources on the table. They have lots of cards that are generating money, and this is typically where the scales start to tip in their favor. This is not a very good or favorable matchup for HB at all. A well-played Haley can easily ruin your day because they usually have enough money to get through your remote multiple times. Now, I'm still gonna continue on with my mission of making my remote as prohibitively expensive as possible, and that starts with Breakaway Grid, which I've drawn at long last. This is going straight into the remote and allows me to start resing my campaigns for basically free. It also makes it viable to actually play the route, which otherwise costs a hefty 6 credits to res. That is really expensive. So once this Adonis campaign in the remote runs out, that's only one more turn because it's ticking down to 0 on my turn, I'll be able to jam the route in there, and that allows me to get the route money for the rest of the game, which is pretty cool. Alright. So we see here that I draw into a bunch of ice. So one thing you notice is that I could have ordered this the other way. I could have installed the root first and then res the root, which allows me to pay for the ice that I just installed on my remote. The reason I did it the other way around, installing the ice before the root, is because I did not actually want to res the root. I wanted to tempt my opponent into running my remote server. That way it will cost them clicks and credits that they otherwise wouldn't spend. This is a crucial tactic to employ against a runner with an economy engine as powerful as that of my opponent. As much as possible, you want to drag your opponent through your remote, force them to spend lots of credits and clicks just to get to the bottom of your server, only to realize that there are no agendas there. The princess is in another castle. That is what you want to do as the corp, and while you do not have any ambushes in your decks, you still have a lot of assets which you can use to bluff as agendas, and that is a very important aspect of playing this deck. Otherwise, your opponent can simply sit back and wait for you to telegraph an agenda and then snipe it from your remote. Of course, I say all of that, it didn't actually do anything in this particular game. My opponent did not fall for the bait, and I was basically not able to tax out my opponent. But hey, at least I still get something out of it. I now have the root installed. I can now use the recurring credits to install ice for free, basically. And that should help me out a lot in building impenetrable servers anyway. Now we speed on ahead with the video to find our opponent striking the first blow with an indexing to R&D. This is a powerful run-based event that threatens to take a huge chunk of genders off the top of my R&D. So it's time to actually res my ice and hopefully keep my opponent out. But they start the run with 28 credits. That's pretty insane. So the first ice up is Architect. This is mainly a gear check. Once they actually have Brahmin out, as mentioned in the start of the video, it costs them merely 1 credit and a single program to break it. Now they then bump into my Ichi, a Bioroid which they can choose to click through, but it's not that expensive to break either. 2 to pump with Brahmin, and 2 to break because each break takes 1 credit but breaks 2 subroutines. So that allows my opponent to get through. Of course, they have to put a program on the top of their stack. But because it's a Bioroid, that Ichi, I get to res another one of my Bioroids, and I have a difficult decision to make here. I can res the third piece of ice, which is yet another Ichi 1.0, or I can go for the Fairchild right at the bottom of the server. The Fairchild will definitely be more annoying for my opponent, but I really do not wish my opponent to then swing over to my remote and trash the route. That is my last economy card. I've run out of campaigns. So if I allow my opponent to get into my remote, I will be poor for the rest of the game, and we can't have that. So even though Fairchild provides more stopping power, I decided to use my my identity ability to res the Ichi 1.0 instead. This leaves me just 1 credit short of resing the Fairchild at the bottom of the server, but that's fine. With these 3 ice in play, it should be quite unlikely that my opponent can make multiple runs through this repeatedly. But they might still be able to make the second run in order to steal whatever they've just put on top of R&D. We shall see about that. My opponent triggers Equivocation. This is a card that allows them to force me to draw the top card of my deck if they want to after revealing it, which is pretty good for getting more mileage out of your R&D run, allowing you to potentially reach deeper into R&D than you normally would be able to. However, it's also good news that giving me this Jeeves is for me, because now I can potentially start playing those mind games again in my remote, where I install a secret card and they have to guess whether it's an agenda or not. So I've already prepared for this. You notice that I've already created a second remote with one piece of ice there. I could potentially put another ice on it. The Fairchild 1 is sitting in my hand right now. That is an ice I'm looking to put on my second remote. Once that second remote is done, I can put the Jeeves there and it will be very hard for my opponent to contest it. Speaking of contesting, my opponent's double dipping to R&D. They definitely have put an agenda on the top, so that's all theirs. I can't do much about it. They steal a corporate sales team. That's all and good. Now they're on 4 points to my 2, but they've lost a lot of money and they've basically sent half their entire rig back into their stack. So I'm taking this opportunity to build myself up with the Jeeves in the remote. And you'll notice because my opponent failed to contest the route, I now have the money to install the outermost ice on my remote, my second remote, and use the route to pay for it. If my opponent does not run that server by the end of the turn, I'll use the 2 remaining recurring credits on the route before my turn ends to then res the Jeeves Model Baroids, giving me a free Jeeves. So this is how you make your money go the extra distance with the route. This deck has a lot of things that you can res and a lot of ice that you can install. So you're practically using the route every single turn. You don't have to worry about, not being able to make the fullest use of the 3 credits. Chances are you probably will be using the most of it. Now I draw into an Adonis campaign here. We can't really play the jamming mind games here. What I'm referring to is installing something in server 1 and hoping my opponent goes for it. 2 reasons. Firstly, I'm too poor to play the jamming mind game. I don't have enough money to rest the 2 ice on my remote, I don't think. But more importantly, my opponent has just played the indexing a couple of turns ago. They know exactly what I'm going to draw. They are not going to run a remote because they know that there are no agendas on top of R&D. So we'll have to wait for a couple more turns before we can start baiting the runner into the remote. Alright, my opponent reinstalls everything they've uninstalled with the Brahman and they're going for R&D again. Very curious because they're not done with the indexing. There's still at least one more card that they saw off the indexing that's still on the top of R&D. But my opponent very deviously arranged R&D such that they would be able to get in again a couple turns later when they've set up their programs again so they can run through the server. But however, they are giving me the ability to trigger Architect of Tomorrow's ability once again. So in conjunction with Architects of Tomorrow and my recurring credits on the route, I'm resing this Fairchild at the bottom of the server at a discount of 7 credits. So I only needed to pay 2 for that. That was very worth it. And my opponent paid the iron price. They broke the Fairchild with Gordian Blade. That set them back immensely. That's, wow, 10 credits to break it, but they do steal exactly what they wanted. The Vitruvius that they put on there so very timely is now theirs, putting them on match point at 6-2. This has left me pretty frazzled. Once your opponent's on match point, you can no longer advance cards in remotes, because if they see your advanced card, they know it's an agenda, they're gonna run it, and my opponent can probably get through it and steal the agenda. So that is a big issue. I'll need to play those mind games on the remote once again, bait them into running it over and over again. So I'm looking at my ice. It's a Fairchild 3 into 2 Seder Adaptive Barriers. I think I need more ice to tax my opponent out. Getting those root credits is so good. Installing the Architect on the outside of server 1 just cost me 3 credits. Very nice. And my opponent just continues setting up. So this is the point of the game where it starts to drag out a bit, where you just keep throwing things in the remote and seeing what sticks. First click is a draw. I want to see if I can draw an agenda here. I don't. So basically I don't really have a choice. I'm just going to throw something in. The question is, do I throw the Adonis campaign or the root? I just went for, it doesn't really matter. I went for the Adonis and we'll see if they run it. We fast forward the video once more. My opponent takes their turn without checking my remote, so I res the Adonis and I go at it again. I trash my Adonis again and jam something else in the remote once more. This time it's the root. You might be asking, aren't you losing money by doing this? It costs more money to res these assets than the money that you're receiving from them. Well, this is what Breaker Bay Grid is for. This is why it's such a powerful card in this deck. Breaker Bay Grid makes your assets so cheap that it is worth trashing them even after just one tick. One tick being the amount of money you get from Adonis campaign for 1 turn, in this case 3 credits. So just leaving Adonis in the remote and then rezzing it and getting 1 turn's worth of Adonis money out of it is still worth it for me, because I'm gaining 3 credits still, because the Adonis costs nothing to res. And the same thing can be said for the root. Anyway, my opponent actually goes for my root this time. It's not an agenda. It really looks like it is, because I'm sacrificing a huge Adonis for another card. So it does look like an agenda, but it's not. And this is what you do with this deck. Just keep jamming in server 1 until they're sick and tired of it, until they start running, and this is where they will lose a lot of their resources. My opponent has to get through the Architect and the Fairchild 3. And the Fairchild 3, after passing it, I decided to res the Fairchild 2 that was guarding my Gs for free with my ID ability, and they have to break through Seder Adaptive Barrier twice. This cost them 2 Lady tokens, and they get to the base of the server. I'm still gonna res the Ash. This is free to res as well, thanks to Breakaway Grid, and I'm gonna trace my opponent. Simple trace of 4 will do. My opponent obviously pays into it, so for a 0 res Ash, my opponent's forced to pay 4 credits. Pretty nasty. They trash the Ash. They find the root to their nasty surprise. And they trash it as well, leaving them with just 1 credit in the bank. This is the scoring window I'm looking for. This is where I want to draw an agenda and throw the agenda in the remote, because they can't contest my remote with just 1 credit. Unfortunately, no agendas. I couldn't find an agenda even after drawing for my clicks. So I could only do the next best thing, to jam yet another campaign in the remote. That made me really sad. That was a very good opportunity to get an agenda out of the way. My opponent surely couldn't contest that remote, but it wasn't to be. So I'll have to wait another turn. My opponent gets a few more credits for their efforts, and I start drawing again. That's an agenda. Okay, we're gonna put in the remote, override the Maryland campaign that's installed, which will be shuffled into R&D due to its effect. I'm not going to advance it because that would telegraph it. Instead, I'm going to leave it there and let Jeeves do the work for me next turn. I'm pretty sure my opponent cannot contest this. They could, but they will break their back doing so. So, of course, my opponent just clicks for credits at this point and then keeps poking at HQ, although there are no agendas in there, so I'm happy with that, and passes the turn to me when I can then score the corporate sales team. This is a powerful agenda to score. For your efforts for quadrupling advancing the corporate sales team, I get 10 credits spread over the next 5 turns. So even though I have no campaigns running at the moment, I will have this steady source of economy which can push me towards the finish line. I just need 1 more agenda to be scored. That is one of the 2 3-point agendas that are in my deck. I will be drawing them sooner or later because I haven't seen either of them yet. I should be expecting them to come up pretty soon. And guess what? Indeed, as my opponent passes the turn to me, I take my mandatory draw. Speak of the devil, it's the agenda I've been waiting for. The agenda that's gonna win either of us the game. So what is the best line of play here? Well, as the saying goes, better strike while the iron's hot. In this case, better score your agenda while your opponent doesn't have the cash to contest it. If I let this game drag out too long, my opponent might poke around my HQ and sniff out the agenda, or worse still, gain enough money such that they can lock down my remote and make a run on their whim. That won't do, so to score it, I'm just gonna install advance it in the remote. I know I can put 4 advancements on it next turn thanks to G, so double advancing it isn't necessary. With my remaining click, I'm gonna use the ability that we've been keeping in mind for almost the entire game. That's right, it's the Vitruvius counter that has been incubating over there. Well, it is perfect time to use it now because I need a defensive upgrade to go in the remote. That's something that's missing since my opponent trashed it the last time. So I'm gonna fetch the Ash that my opponent trashed last time and jam it into the remote. This way, my elective upgrade is pretty well guarded. It means that my opponent cannot simply just calculate the amount of money needed to break the 4 eyes on my remote. They also have to take into account the amount of money I have in my credit pool, because I can pump as many or as few credits as I want into the Ash trace so as to keep them off my server one time. Now let's turn the tables and tackle this from the runner's point of view. They start their turn with a respectable 13 credits, but they're missing one very key tool, their David. This card is installed in the rig, however, it has no counters on it, so this option is kind of out of contention for this particular problem. Analyzing the server, we realize that this is going to be quite a big problem without David, because the main restricting factor here is the Fairchild 3.0. This ice cannot be broken efficiently, that is to say without investing a lot of money, unless you use David or unless you spend your entire turn, 3 clicks clicking through it. This basically restricts what you can do during your turn. My opponent basically has to run this server on their first click and spend the remainder of their turn clicking through the Fairchild. In that case, they would have to spend 7 credits to get past all these other ice. 1 credit for the Architect, and 6 credits for the remaining 2 Satyr Adaptive Barriers. But that will leave my opponent with just 1 credit short, because even though they started the run with 13 credits, they need more than that to steal my agenda because of the ash that is awaiting them at the bottom of the server. Instead of concentrating on a futile vector of attack, my opponent instead diverted their attention to my alternative remote containing the Jeeves and realized that their best shot was actually to slow me down by trashing the Jeeves, because if Jeeves goes away, I cannot score this agenda. I need to place 4 advancement counters on it, but I only have 3 clicks. So they run my Jeeves and I'm now forced to defend it. This is where my defenses are coming into play for me. Having invested in a somewhat well-defended second remote, I'm now able to tax out my opponent for virtually no credits. Don't forget, the Fairchild 2 at the bottom was res for free by my ID ability earlier on, and the outermost Fairchild 1 was installed for free with the root money. So essentially I'm only paying 1 credit for this server to rest the Fairchild 1 on the outside, and my opponent had to pay a bunch of money to run through it, and then 5 additional credits to trash the Jeeves itself. So that was a pretty expensive play for my opponent, but it was necessary to delay the game by 1 more turn. In the meantime, I get a couple more corporate sales team credits from my agenda pool, and as I stare down at the agenda I just drew, well, my opponent doesn't know I drew this agenda. So I'm gonna keep as straight of a poker face as I possibly can over this online setting, and with a cool and calm head, advance this agenda in the remote once more. So that's a double advance agenda in the remote, and with my remaining clicks, I'm just gonna click for credits because there's no reason not to. Of course, every single extra credit I can get in my credit pool equates to increased defenses for my remote, because that's an extra credit I can place into the ash trace. Passing my turn over, my opponent suddenly realizes they're basically stuck in the same position as they were at the start of last turn, albeit for one small but very significant difference. Do you notice what it is? Pause the video if you need to think about it. Yep, you probably have noticed it, but David now suddenly has 3 counters on it. Where did these counters come from? What happened? Well, when they ran my Jeeves remote, they broke one of the ice with the Brahman. Brahman allowed them to place their exhausted David onto the top of their stack. They then drew it last turn and then installed it again last turn. So they're starting this turn with a fresh David with 3 power counters on it. Now this is the game changer, because now with a loaded David, they can start breaking my ice much more cheaply. The Satyr Adaptive Barriers cost no money, instead of the 3 credits needed for Lady, and the Fairchild 3 can now be broken. However, there's a big catch here. The Fairchild 3 has 3 subroutines. That David will be soaked up by the Fairchild 3, leaving them with 2 Satyrs to contest and no money to do so. If they spend the 7 credits that we outlined in the PowerPoint illustration earlier, my opponent would arrive at the bottom of the server with just 3 credits. That's definitely not enough to contest the ash trace. This was where my opponent had to pull out some creativity to solve this very unique problem. So they had a 3 loaded David and the key here was to spread it out across all 3 eyes. So the highlighted parts in blue were the subroutines that my opponent planned to break using the David. 1 subroutine for each ice. But what about the remaining 2 subroutines on Fairchild 3? Well, it turns out, if you notice, these subroutines are actually rather irrelevant, because my opponent can simply opt to trash one of their installed cards for each of those subroutines. Having lots of installed cards that are of going to be no use for them for the remainder of the game, because the game was about to end anyway, my opponent could easily just trash their installed cards to get past the need to pay credits to break Fairchild 3. This way, my opponent, instead of having to pay 7 credits for this entire server, they only need spend 1 credit for the Architect. This freed up my opponent's 3 remaining clicks as well, which they could use to click for credits. And surprisingly, after all of that, when all the maths is said and done, they approached my remote server with 12 credits in their pool to my 8. I could only pump the base Trace 4 of Ash by 8. That's 12 credits. My opponent had exactly the right number of credits to get through. No more, no less. They paid into the Trace and promptly stole the agenda, leaving me also infuriated, but at the same time so satisfied, because that was truly a nail-biting finish. Now, I know this video has gone on for a long time, so I won't hold you back too much longer. I just want to comment as an ending note that this is the kind of games that I live for when I sit down to play Netrunner. Such a nail-biting finish where you can have 2 decks pit against each other, and with 2 experienced players at the helms respectively, as myself and Tris were, we were able to duke it out, and Tris managed to eke out the win by the thinnest of margins. That's amazing. The best part of it is, it wasn't, you know, all down to RNG or luck. Sometimes it's good to have those kinds of finishes where it's determined by a coin flip or something, but this one, it was all about skill. From managing your economy well, to finding out the best lines of attack, we both put in our all, and Tris just happened to come ahead. I'm sure I could have done better if I had gotten just 1 more tick from a campaign, one more, you know, 1 more turn's worth of economy. That would have changed the outcome outright. So there's always room for improvement, and I'm sure you can spot some of them as you look back from this video. But I hope this has inspired you to try these decks out for yourself, because they are really a lot of fun. Once again, thanks for watching, and I hope you have fun with these decks. Happy net running. I'll see you next time. Goodbye. Now, I know this video has gone on for a long time, so I won't hold you back too much longer. I just want to comment as an ending note that this is the kind of games that I live for when I sit down to play Netrunner. Such a nail-biting finish where you can have 2 decks pit against each other, and with 2 experienced players at the helms respectively, as myself and Tris were, we were able to duke it out, and Tris managed to eke out the win by the thinnest of margins. That's amazing. The best part of it is, it wasn't, you know, all down to RNG or luck. Sometimes it's good to have those kinds of finishes where it's determined by a coin flip or something, but this one, it was all about skill. From managing your economy well, to finding out the best lines of attack, we both put in our all, and Tris just happened to come ahead. I'm sure I could have done better if I had gotten just 1 more tick from a campaign, 1 more, you know, 1 more turn's worth of economy. That would have changed the outcome outright. So there's always room for improvement, and I'm sure you can spot some of them as you look back from this video. But I hope this has inspired you to try these decks out for yourself, because they are really a lot of fun. Once again, thanks for watching, and I hope you have fun with these decks. Happy net running. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.